So I thought what advice would you give to the mayor or anyone like that about what to do with public spaces? I was reminded of the graffiti that appeared on the walls in Paris in '68, be realistic, demand the impossible. And I thought, what is the impossible thing to ask for in terms of public space? I mean, obviously that's a statement that relates to revolutionary change and so on. But I thought that there's certain things that feel impossible but are actually quite small requests in a strange way. And basically, with regard to public spaces, it's almost impossible to imagine, leaving it alone or not meddling with it, letting it be blank, letting it be empty, letting it be windswept, or letting it be unproductive, perhaps. Because when you think about, or when I think about public space, there's sort of a few kind of logics that come to mind. The kind of one of the most obvious ones would be festival, about providing rhythm to the year, about giving the people something to, a kind of deeper structure to life and time, animation to collective life. But then there are other kind of, there's questions of power in public space as well. They can be part of a kind of monumental display of power and so on. And then, of course, they can also be, as kind of people hint at and is often discussed, the public spaces are the places that people come to when they're very upset. And it raises this question of how do you plan for the unplanned, or how do you allow for activities that aren't part of the program of public spaces to happen? And I think that's a kind of impossible question for a number of reasons, and it's partly to do with who makes the spaces, but also what we expect them to do, So this is Granary Square, somewhere I spend quite a lot of time, but you often see things like this shown as examples of, great public space. And who would complain? It's got fountains when the sun's shining, it's lovely, it's got art students, it's got restaurants and things like that. But underneath, it's serving a function which is as a kind of bauble, adding a little bit of luster to millions of square feet of office space and apartments that are getting built around there. And of course, as we all know, spaces like that are not half as public as they're said to be. Now, you hear a lot about the argument about privately owned public space, about the fact that people can be relegated from that space, they can be kept out, certain activities can be banned, and so on. And this, of course, is a very bad thing. I do think that private public space is not intrinsically bad. It's not as if public spaces owned by the state are somehow entirely free for us to do whatever we want in. We're perfectly capable of being restricted in our movements through state-owned spaces. But that argument does speak to a sense that, in London especially, there feels like over the last generation or so, there's a kind of sense of freedom that seems to be vanishing, even as things improve. And I'm not just talking about, say, squats or like kind of illegal raves or things like that, like the kind of celebrated alternative uses of space. But there's a certain kind of freedom that is very, very difficult to get a hold on. And I do think that it's almost impossible, but if you don't keep a hold of that, you end up with basically the letting agent's view of the world, where everything's a total mess. Every square meter has a pound sign attached to it, and anything that isn't happening there is a waste somehow. Like anything empty or unused is somehow a problem to be solved. And of course, the kind of ideal public space, in a way, has a certain kind of melancholy emptiness to it in its own way. I mean, that has much more in common with Alexanderplatz than it does with, Granary Square or something like that. And I do think policymakers can't really say anything about this because it's a logic to the way we live. It's the logic of our current stage of capitalism and so on. But there's always a kind of sense that, think spaces like this, they're lovely, and who doesn't like a chain Lebanese restaurant? I mean, that's great, and who doesn't like sitting outside, and who doesn't enjoy the fact that cars aren't driving past you all the time? But it would be nice if we could somehow figure out what else could public space give us. And that, I think, is impossible, but we kind of have to keep it in mind when we consider what kind of spaces we need as any culture going into the future. Thank you. Thank you.